You're listening to Quantum Conversations with Karen Curry Parker. Join us as we explore new frontiers in consciousness, science, and evolution. And now here's your host, Karen Curry Parker.
According to noted scientist and best-selling author of The Conscious Universe, Dean Radin, magic is a natural aspect of reality, and each one of us can tap into this power with diligent practice. But wait, aren't things like ESP and telepathy just wishful thinking and flights of the imagination? Not according to Dean Radin, who worked on the U.S. government's top-secret psychic espionage program known as Stargate. Radin has spent the last 40 years conducting controlled experiments that demonstrate that thoughts are things, that we can sense others' emotions and intentions from a distance, that intuition is way more powerful than we thought, and that we can tap into the power of intention, think The Secret, only in a more realistic and scientific level. These dormant powers can help us lead more interesting, more meaningful, and fulfilling lives. The history of science is rooted in the traditions of magic. Science emerged as a way of understanding the mystery of magic and the mystery of life. But science, as a standalone body of knowledge, is incomplete and doesn't account for the fact that more than 90% of scientists report that they themselves have had mystical, dare I say, magical experiences. Scientists also report that more than 50% of scientific discoveries come from serendipity, divine accidents, magic. But magic without science is also an incomplete way of understanding the world. Magic without science is superstition and keeps us from understanding how to harness the power of science and magic to solve the challenges facing humanity today.
Hi, and welcome to Quantum Conversations. I'm Karen Curry Parker, and I'm super excited to have Dr. Dean Radin here with me today. We're going to be talking about his new book, Real Magic. Dr. Radin, or Dean, is the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and associate distinguished professor of integral and transpersonal psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He earned an MS in electrical engineering and a PhD in psychology from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where my niece just graduated on Sunday. And before joining the research staff at IONS in 2001, he held appointments with AT&T Bell Labs, Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, and SRI International. He is the author or co-author of hundreds of technical and popular articles, 4 dozen book chapters, and 4 popular books, including The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, Supernormal, and his new book, Real Magic. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm happy to be here.
Oh, every time we have these conversations, I have so many things I want to talk about. But the piece that I think is so profound about this book, which is a little bit different than some of your previous work, it really lays out or sort of builds, I think, a really powerful bridge between what I think is our intuitive understanding of the world and your brilliant scientific background that you bring to it. So I want to talk a little bit about, first of all, the history of magic and science. And I know that this is a good chunk of the book was the history of magic. And I'm wondering if you can just summarize briefly and maybe even just talk a little bit about the difference between exoteric and esoteric understanding and knowledge and how those played out and how this kind of got split up as 2 different sort of branches of knowledge and how perhaps those are beginning to be interwoven yet again.
To do that briefly is difficult, which is why I had to write an entire book about it. But in essence, imagine that it's 5,000 or 10,000 years ago, and nothing was understood, or at least it was the models of reality that people came up with were based on stories and what mystics described as the nature of reality. But it was pre-scientific times. So the language that was used was mostly allegorical in terms of trying to understand anything. So sometime probably starting about somewhere between 2,000 years ago and maybe 500 years ago, people noticed that there were certain regularities that happened in the natural world. Mm-hmm. And this then became a split from previous ideas, which are all considered supernatural, meaning divine. The gods did it. Like the gods made thunder, the gods did everything because no one knew how anything worked. But because regularities started to be seen, it split from supernatural magic into natural magic. So nobody understood how magnetism worked, but they knew that it was a thing. And the same goes with making small electrical sparks, and certain herbs would heal people. So natural magic evolved away from supernatural magic. Mm-hmm. Eventually, some aspects of natural magic, including alchemy and herbalism and astrology, kept evolving, and the idea of magic was no longer necessary. So alchemy became chemistry, and herbalism became the pharmaceutical business, and astrology more or less became astronomy. So from a direct lineage from ancient magical ideas, it turned into natural magic, that turned into science. Mm-hmm. You can trace this through history very, very nicely. But there was something left out of that transition. The transition from natural magic into science is roughly about 400 years old now. Mm-hmm. What was left out, even from natural magic, was that the alchemists knew that there was something important about the consciousness of the practitioner that was important in the alchemical process. And the same for herbalism, the same for astrology, and so on. That was left out because when science developed, it created a split essentially between mind and matter, or consciousness and the physical universe. The split is oftentimes thought of as being René Descartes, who made this split. But there are many others who are thinking of how do we carve out our understanding of the physical world, the natural physical world, from the rest of us, our sense of self, consciousness, and so on. So the split very roughly is one side turned to religion, which took care of the mind and the soul, and the other side took care of the physical world. That's what allowed science to really gain a foothold and develop into the form that we see it today. Mm-hmm. But the problem, again, is that the split was completely artificial. It was done more for political reasons than for scientific reasons. And I think what's happening now is that as more and more scientists and scholars are looking at the nature of consciousness, they're realizing that there's something very peculiar about it. It's more and more difficult to simply ignore. And now it's becoming a scientific problem again, because the worries about religion are not quite as bad as they used to be. Mm-hmm. And in the process, this is one of the major themes in the book then, in the process of trying to understand consciousness from a scientific perspective, it begins to provide new clues about the nature of reality. Mm-hmm. And one of those clues strongly implies that what used to be called magic, real magic, actually does exist.
So I want to back up for a little bit, and then I want to move forward with that concept, because I think it is a very calming and reassuring concept, because I think that there's a lot of, when somebody steps into, let's say, the realm of magic, and the way you kind of define the realm of magic, it's really oftentimes sort of associated with consciousness, intention, and attention, right?
Right.
And this idea that, oh, maybe this isn't just some hopeful thing I'm doing because I don't know I'm going to resolve some conflict in my life, or because I don't know what to do about the political situation, so I'm going to hope and hold space and intend, right? And you wonder, in fact, there was a big backlash last year about you can't just hold space, you got to do something. And this sort of feeling of disempowerment around, well, I can't do something, I don't know what to do about the political situation other than to go vote, or, maybe do something in my community. The sense that maybe consciousness has more power to it than we started with. But before we have a little bit of a conversation about that, I want to back it up a little bit, because one of the things that you've done that I think is pretty profound is you have worked on structuring ways to measure the effects scientifically of consciousness. And in particular, you've you worked with random number generation machines and looking at the impact on intention and attention on the generation of random factors. Can you talk a little bit about that for us?
Sure. You mentioned something that sparked an idea before I get into that, and that is that after every horrible school shooting, all a politician says, we offer our thoughts and prayers. Mm-hmm. And it's maddening because it's true that, well, that's nice that they're thinking about it, but we do want action as well. Mm-hmm. So, pull back from that and say, well, do thoughts and prayers actually do anything? It turns out they do. It's not the same as physical action, but there are measurable effects as a result. Mm-hmm. So it on the one hand, we get tired of hearing that kind of response because it means that no laws are going to change. On the other hand, it actually is doing something. So in the laboratory, the way that we test this, and we've used electronic random number generators as one of the tools, and I'll describe why in a minute, but many, many other targets have been used. Everything from cell cultures to small animals to human physiology to studies that I describe in the book involving chocolate and water and tea and so on. Lots of different kinds of targets to see what happens when you direct your attention towards a physical system. Mm-hmm. So random generators are a popular tool because the underlying concept here is that it appears that there's a big difference between mind and matter, right? Mm-hmm. Mind is sort of in there. It's subjective. It's locked inside of you somehow. So in the world is out there. We get the sense that there's no direct connection between them unless you go and do something. So if mind and matter are actually more similar to each other than we usually think and not so separate, mm-hmm. and if you have somebody who is linked to the generator in some way, in the laboratory, you do that by having the random generator be used as a target to select images or to make a squiggly line on a screen that is linked back to what the generator is doing, then you're connected to it in some fashion. So you can ask somebody to try to influence the generator, make the squiggly line move up, which would mean mm-hmm. that it's producing more 1 bits than 0 bits, say, in a random mm-hmm. binary generator. And the evidence shows that people can do that. It's a pretty small effect, but when you get enough people and enough data, you can show that the intention made a difference. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, you can say, well, how did it work? Well, from a conventional scientific perspective, we're starting to look at things like maybe there's some kind of a signal that comes out of the mind or the brain that is influencing the electronics in some way. Well, that has been tested, and that is not the case. There are no signals that are passing between the device and the person. One of the values then of looking at the esoteric traditions, the traditions that are all about consciousness, essentially, mm-hmm. is that, again, it suggests that there really are no major differences between mind and matter. So if my mind becomes extremely coherent in the process of focusing on a generator, that coherence is going to be reflected by matter. The mind becomes coherent. Well, matter has to become coherent as well. And the linkage is I'm paying attention to that system. So the two systems now are going to go into coherence because my mind is coherent. Well, how do you detect coherence in a random system? It's very easy to do through use of statistics. So if you think of a random system as a bunch of zeros and ones in a random order, mm-hmm. coherence can be seen as momentarily just a whole bunch of ones are being generated or a whole bunch of zeros, something like that. And so the experiments are designed this way. You direct your attention at a system, you see if it goes into coherence, and then you withdraw your attention and see if it goes back to acting randomly. Those experiments have been done many, many times in different ways, and the overall evidence suggests that, yeah, a single person and a single random number generator are correlated in some way related to attention. So now you can expand the idea, take the generator out into the world, and simply look at large-scale events, like big things happening in the world with lots of random generators all over the place, and see, again, is there a correlation between collective mind attention mm-hmm. and the behavior of these random generators? And again, the answer is yes.
It's pretty I think that's pretty powerful stuff because, again, it speaks to the fact that maybe we have a certain modicum of control over what we create and what we experience that we haven't fully learned to tap into yet. So one of the things you talk about in your new book is the power of intention and attention, and that being sort of the energy that harnesses this consciousness and influences what we generate. Can you talk to us briefly for a minute about I know this is kind of maybe splitting hairs a little bit, but I think it's an important piece to understand the difference between attention and intention and how those two work together.
Attention, as a metaphor, is you're in a dark room with a flashlight, and you can direct where the flashlight points and illuminate something. So it's simply movement of what you're paying attention to. But that's not intention. Intention is I want, desire for something. Mm-hmm. So you can have desire without attention for any particular object. Like you could do a meditation or a prayer where you're internally saying something about I want world peace, but you're not particularly focusing on the entire world. It's more about the concept of I want this. Mm-hmm. You can do attention without intention, or you can do both. So typically, if you have a loved one who is feeling ill, you will direct your attention toward them, mm-hmm. and then you put it in intention that they would feel better. So that's typically what we do in the laboratory is we do both attention to direct the mind and then intention to get a certain outcome.
Okay, good. So the other thing you talk about is what I would call psychic phenomenon, precognizance, psychokinesis, and the fact that maybe there's more validity even to those kinds of experiences than, well, let me ask you this real quick before I even go there. Traditional science, how do they respond to your work? Do they get excited about what you do, or do you freak people out with it? I'm just really curious because I suspect that. Let me back it up and just say we interviewed Rupert Sheldrake a few weeks ago, and I think about Sheldrake's work on conscious evolution and how we have a consciousness around evolution that's pretty fixed and pretty still. I know it's not as Darwinian as it was maybe 50 years ago, but people are a little bit wigged out about the idea that there's more consciousness involved in evolution. How do your fellow scientists respond or react to you coming out and saying, look, it's not as random as you think?
There's a public answer and there's a private answer. Uh-huh. In public, scientists learn very quickly that you don't talk about these things. There's mm-hmm. a taboo about talking about it because it clashes with the materialist philosophy that underlies science. So you could lose your job if you start talking too favorably about these things, so you just don't talk about it. Privately, it's a completely different issue. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Privately, when you do a survey, as we did recently, where we ask 3 categories of people about experiences that they've had. So we had a list of 25 different kinds of psychic experiences, everything from clairvoyance to gut feelings, to psychokinesis, to talking to fairies, to all kinds of stuff, a long list. Mm-hmm. We asked people to simply indicate which one of these experiences they've had. So one group of people that we asked, we would call psychic enthusiasts. Uh-huh. So not surprisingly, 99% of them said they had experienced at least one of those kinds of experiences. The second category was the general public. 94% said they had experienced at least one experience. Wow. And of the 25, an average of around 7 of the 25 that they've personally experienced.
Wow.
Then we asked scientists and engineers. And our expectation was, well, it's going to be very low because the way that these effects are portrayed in the scientific literature usually is that this is stupid. And yet, so what's your guess? What's your guess of the percentage of scientists and engineers who said, yes, they've had at least one such experience?
63%.
93%.
Get out. That's amazing. But they don't talk about it?
What?
But they don't talk about it in public?
Oh, yeah. That's the illustration of a taboo. that when asked anonymously, have you had the experiences, the overwhelming majority says, yeah, I've had those experiences, but they don't talk about it. So there's a minority of scientists and engineers who are comfortable enough with their status that they can talk about it openly, but most cannot. It's not that they're not interested because they have the experience, but they learn that they cannot talk about it. So that's the split. It's a very classic kind of taboo.
Interesting. And do you feel like it's changed in the last 15, 20 years?
In terms of the private side, probably not. Because when you're dealing with above 90% of the population, that's basically everyone.
Right.
The nature of the taboo is beginning to change in the sense that 30 years ago, if you said that you're interested in consciousness and that was your research topic, you would have been laughed at. You could lose your job. Now it's acceptable. It's mostly in the domain of philosophy and the neurosciences. But the fact that there are an increasing number of physicists and people in other fields where you wouldn't think they'd be interested in consciousness at all, they can talk about it. And these are now thought leaders. So if the thought leaders can do it, then people will follow. And the taboo is beginning to break down, which is great.
That's exciting. So, okay, back to my original question. Sorry, I went down a rabbit hole there, but I was curious, like, what do scientists talk about at cocktail parties on Fridays?
Yeah. After a few drinks.
So talk to me about the scientific validation around things like psychic phenomenon, all the 25 psychic phenomenon on your list. Is there evidence that shows that maybe that whole experience that you have? I mean, I'm a mom, I have 8 kids. You know, I feel like I feel my kids. Like sometimes I'll know, oh, if so-and-so is going to call because I can feel like she's really not having a good day. Talk to me about the validity of those kinds of phenomena and more.
So this was the topic of my first 2 books. The first book was A Conscious Universe. It came out over 20 years ago already. In that book, I describe how science has addressed the classic forms, elementary forms of psychic phenomena, like telepathy, clairvoyance, and so on. And the upshot is that in science, the currency is that not only do you do a properly controlled experiment, but that it is repeatable by others. Mm-hmm. So I described how you measure repeatability, how you know whether something is real or not, and then went through the various kinds of classes of experiments that have tested telepathy and clairvoyance and so on. So from that perspective, from the data perspective and experiments, the nature of the evidence, even 20 years ago, it's much better today. 20 years ago, it was possible to already state that based on the evidence, if these phenomena were considered ordinary, they would be well accepted in science. There's no question. And one of the things I talk about in my book now on magic is that I don't need to talk about that anymore. If you read the literature on this, from a scientific perspective, these are as certain as any other phenomena that we study. And the way that I needed to say something in this book about that. So my approach was, besides giving a little bit about the background, I quoted the president of the American Statistical Association. So statistics is the domain of science that evaluates data. So the president, who's a colleague of mine, Jessica Utz, she was the president of the American Statistical Association and gave a lecture for the annual meeting and said in that lecture what I just said here, that based on the evidence itself, if these phenomena were not considered controversial, they would be well accepted. That's what the data tells us. And if a statistician whose job is to evaluate data properly can say that, then the existential question is basically solved. But it raises another question, which is the point of the book. Well, then how do you explain this stuff? And in order to answer that question, it's not an easy question to answer. It's not that there's a special particle that we haven't found yet that's getting from your brain to another brain. It's not that. It's probably not even quantum mechanics. It's something else. So the something else takes a book to describe it in some detail.
Yes. And And so how do you do research on that something else? How do you have an inkling like where you're going to find? I know these are strange questions, but I really want to know, like, what is that factor then if you're not measuring it by like putting somebody's head in a lead shield so they're not transmitting something, and if you know that it's something else but you don't know what it is, are there cracks and openings in our scientific understanding that are maybe leading us down the path towards what that something else might be?
Well, fortunately, yes. The something else, and from a conventional scientific perspective, can be described as the leading edge in physics primarily, where it is thought by some that reality, physical reality and subjective reality, is actually based on information. Mm-hmm. We live in an informational space. To put it in more popular terms, it's a little bit like living in the Matrix. Mm-hmm. We're living in a simulation, not because the simulation isn't real, it's a real thing, mm-hmm. but it's a lot more like computer software. It's informational in nature. Well, there's a very close synonym for information, which is symbolism, linguistics, mm-hmm. consciousness. All of these words are kind of revolving around the same general notion. There's something peculiar about information, mathematics, and you see, again, thought leaders talking about reality literally is mathematics. Mathematics mm-hmm. is a symbolic language. So reality is a symbolic language. That's, again, informational. What is consciousness? Consciousness is a combination of awareness plus ability to process information. So this is starting to sound somewhat abstract, but after all, we're trying to describe the nature of reality. It's going to be pretty abstract because our ordinary senses are not revealing reality. It's revealing a construction primarily from the brain. Right. And we're limited by the language. We're limited by how I can describe something to you. So we don't have the mathematics of this yet, but there are people working on it. And the challenge is starting from a purely informational domain. It's just a descriptive domain. How does that turn into physical world? So this is an aspect of mathematics now. It's an aspect of physics. People are working on this problem. The relevance then to both consciousness and magic is that one of the primary themes in magic is that your intentions can manipulate reality. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult to figure out how that could work if you're working within the standard materialistic viewpoint. Because we're talking then about some of your thoughts or somehow manipulating the world. It doesn't make any sense. It makes a lot of sense, though, if what you call me, the thing inside of you, that is your awareness, if that awareness is linked or maybe even identical to this underlying consciousness from which the world arises, mm-hmm. then it makes more sense that if the world arises out of consciousness, say that the universe itself arises out of some kind of universal consciousness, just mm-hmm. as a hypothesis, and that consciousness and your consciousness are made of the same stuff, then you would have a similar ability to generate a universe as whatever that universal consciousness does, except you have this much of it, and universal consciousness has a big amount of it, so it can simply do more. Mm-hmm. We have this much ability to create our own universe, to manipulate the physical world. And that's pretty much what we see in the laboratory. When we ask somebody to do something psychic in the laboratory, they can do it, but it's usually this big, under controlled conditions. Mm-hmm. In the everyday world, it's much bigger, but it's uncontrolled, and typically is evolved with emotion and motivation that it's very difficult to produce in the laboratory. So I then make the distinction for, let's assume that everything is made out of consciousness. What's in there is consciousness with a small c, and what's out there somehow is consciousness with a big C, and that ultimately then becomes the origin of the reality itself. And that, by the way, is what the magical traditions say.
And so the next interesting place to go with that equation then becomes, what if we all harness our little C's together? Can we then, with that harnessed power of our collaborative little C's then change the nature of our collective reality. Like, for example, let's say hypothetically, we all have an unconscious belief that says on this planet, the sky is blue. And so when we are on this planet embodying the little C and the consciousness of the planet, we have a blue sky. But what if, again, hypothetically, we all got together and said, blue is boring. Let's do a different color. Can we change the nature of our reality then from that experience by harnessing the little level of consciousness?
We probably shouldn't use that as a target, because if the atmosphere changed from blue to some other color, we'd all be dead very quickly.
Yes.
The chemical composition would change. But can we change some aspects of the physical world? The answer is yes. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, what I'm talking about it with consciousness is, from a philosophical perspective, it's called idealism, that the reality is ultimately in consciousness. But one of the challenges to idealism is that it turns into solipsism pretty quickly. So solipsism is the idea that actually everything is completely mental, that the physical world doesn't even exist. Mm-hmm. That's not what I'm saying. So what I'm saying is that that consciousness emerges into the physical world. We live in a really physical, material place that has its own set of laws and everything else. So we don't change the physics textbooks, and we don't change the chemistry textbooks, and we don't change any of that. All of science is still right, except that it has a new underlying assumption to it, that consciousness permeates the whole thing, and that consciousness has properties before space and time. That then becomes an easy way to describe why psychic phenomena work, why mysticism works, why magic works, because it's always there. It's awareness that spans everything. Mm-hmm. And so you could change physical world a little bit, but there's an enormous amount of inertia. Once the physical world is set, and by the way, it's not by human consciousness, it's by some other large, major consciousness thing out there, from which the physical world emerges. So that has its own set of laws, and it doesn't like to change. Mm-hmm. Because you change, you tweak one tiny little thing in terms of how the physical world works, it all comes crashing down quickly. So there's a lot of resistance to that. In the laboratory, we use systems where we can easily measure that something has changed. And the fact that a cell culture changes doesn't disturb the rest of the universe very much. So we can do that kind of changes, but big changes that would force a local anomaly in space-time, I think we're fortunate in that is not so easy to change, because it really would destroy everything almost immediately.
Well, I think it also speaks to kind of perhaps the benevolence that when we say your thoughts create your reality, for example, or you create your reality, that there's a certain need for critical mass and maybe even consistency with that. Otherwise, God knows what we'd be doing to each other on the highway, right? So, right. But here's the really last question I want to wind up with. And I know this is going a little bit of a different direction, but I think it really feeds beautifully with, what you've written in this book. Is I completely agree with you that, it's not a matter of me agreeing with it. It's reality. We live in a physical, manifested 3D world that has a specific set of laws and a specific way of behaving. And that if we want to make change in the world, let's bring it back to school shootings, for example. The way in which we want to make the change, because this is what's accepted, is obviously we want to change regulation, for example. And I'm not taking any side because I don't want this to be a political piece, but we go through the actions that are structured into our government body, for example. But does it make sense if we are reaching a place where there is enough of a critical mass of people on the planet who are saying, you know what? I'm done with murder. I'm done with war. I'm done with poverty. We're facing a crisis of carrying capacity on a biological level on the planet. And there has to be an elegant solution to this somehow that's equitable and sustainable. I'm done with the doom and gloom. Let's find a solution. Is it possible that if we harness our consciousness collectively and add love and light, or whatever words you want to use, really hold an intention and focus our attention on the possibility of change and combine that with doing the work of the physical world, can we dramatically accelerate our capacity to create change on the planet.
Yes, and that's how it's always worked.
Okay, good.
The studies show that roughly 10% of the population will pull the rest of the 90%. So if 10% of the population is highly focused, has a very clear intention of what they want to produce, and you get enough people to follow, that changes everything. I mean, to not be too political about it, but if people vote where their passion is, and they actually do vote and they push, at least within our government, that makes very dramatic changes. We've seen that already. Mm-hmm. So we live fortunately in a dictatorship, so our individual intentions do matter a lot. One of the things about the collective intention, though, is that the intentions have to be very strongly in alignment. And that can only happen if everybody knows exactly what it is that they're intending toward. It has to be crystal clear. We see even in the laboratory context that you can do an experiment where you're asking one person to do something and you can see an effect. So you kind of expect, well, let's get 10 people. It'll be 10 times bigger. Almost never happens. Because it's very, very difficult, even when people are in alignment. They're clear about what they want. There's just slight differences in terms of exactly how people are intending. And if you think of it as a wave-like structure, one person has a wave and another has another wave, to get them all exactly into alignment is very, very difficult. And when you have waves that are slightly out of alignment, you start getting interference patterns. Those interference patterns will reduce the overall effectiveness. So one really powerful intender can be much better than 100 people. We're all trying to do the same thing. It takes a very good leader of a group who can make absolutely clear what the goal is. Then you can start to get more alignment, and that becomes a more powerful push. But as I said, it's really difficult to get more than one person to be very clear on what their outcome is.
Thank you for that. So everybody needs to become really good intenders.
Well, I take the example of praying for peace. Right. So if you have a million people meditating for peace on a given day, but you have a million different ideas about what peace means.
Right.
It'll feel good to do that, but it won't necessarily actually do anything. So the instruction then is that we're going to do exactly this kind of thing. Then you have the problem in that most people can't sustain attention for very long. So we see in the laboratory, even with trained meditators, that if you ask somebody to do something, think exactly about this thing. Meanwhile, we're taking their EEG to look at how their brain's responding. They can do exactly that thing for like 5 seconds. And then we see that the brain starts to think about other things. And these were experienced people. So it takes a very unusually talented meditator to be able to sustain attention for minutes. Some can do it for hours, but that's rare. Most people can't do that. And so you need a way of repeatedly pulling. This is what we're doing. This is what we're doing periodically to keep people pulling back into the same direction. This is, I think, one of the reasons why drumming circles work, because the rhythm pushes people, and why other rituals work as well.
Interesting. All right, good. So Dean Radin, right? Did I say that right?
Yeah.
Real magic. If you have ever felt like you were the weird one in your family, if you were the one psychic in a family of engineers or whatever other scientists, get this book. Firstly, I just want to say, read this book just for the history of magic. I loved that section so much. I have never seen anybody lay out the relationship between science and magic so beautifully. So thank you for that, because that in and of itself was so affirming. And then go through the rest of the book and read the information and the data. And it's data. It's not just, Dean's opinions. This is data that says your experience of these otherworldly phenomenon are valid, and they are part of your own way of knowing and navigating the world. And just, I think, such powerful and such important work. And I think such a beautiful way to continue to bridge that place where we understand the material world and the phenomena of the material world and incorporate into it the spirit of the world too, maybe is a way of putting it, and weave those two together as we continue to evolve and grow on this planet. Are you sure we can't have a yellow sky? I think that would be kind of fun just for a day.
No, yellow would be particularly bad.
Okay.
I don't want to mess with it.
So thank you so much for joining us. You can find out more about Dean Radin on his website, deanradin.org. Is that right?
Yeah.
And Radin is Radin. Go there. There's all kinds of interesting information. There's articles. There's all kinds of different ways you can learn from this phenomenal body of work. And I appreciate you so much coming and sharing a quantum conversation with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Modern science explains why magic will play a key role in the frontiers of science. Quantum physics is incomplete without understanding the seemingly magical influence of perspective, consciousness, and how the power of simple observation can change the behavior of quantum particles. Science helps us stop being afraid of magic. For decades, we killed sorceresses, witches, and anyone who seemed to be able to consciously harness the natural creative power of the universe. Magic with science supports the deep inner knowing that many of us are born remembering. We come from a force that has created worlds, planets, and once we remember the power we have to harness this force, or how to live as this force, we will discover elegant solutions to the challenges facing us today. Focused attention and intention influences the behavior of random events. Science shows this. If we can change the random nature of how numbers are generated by simply focusing, imagine what we can collectively create if we are all focusing on creating sustainable, peaceful abundance for the world. The elegant solutions are out there. The potential for a peaceful world is a moving quantum potential right now. The more we pay attention, focus, and intend, science shows us the greater the chances are that we can leverage the probability of creating what we want to see in the world in our favor for the greater good of humanity. We cannot have pure science without a sprinkling of magic, and we can't have magic without a sprinkling of science. When we put these two ways of understanding and leveraging the world together, we will deepen our ability to harness our own natural creative power. If science proves to us that the idea of you create your own reality is actually a somewhat valid tenet, then the first step in changing reality and experiencing what you really want in life is to know who is the I that is creating your reality. Human design is a powerful way to get to know your unique way of creating in the world. Your human design gives you a blueprint for who you are and how to live the highest expression of who you are in the world. Get your free human design blueprint and report by visiting our Quantum Conversations Facebook page. I want to end with this amazing thought. Did you know that you are so powerful that you can turn light into matter? That's exactly what your brain does every minute. Your brain communicates to your body via photon storms, storms of light. Those storms tell your body what kind of chemicals to produce, and in response, what kinds of experiences you'll have. I'm Karen Curry Parker, and I just want to say to you today, I'm standing in awe of your creative power.
Thanks for listening to Quantum Conversations with Karen Curry Parker. For more information, visit joyfulmission.com.